and welcome to the Style Matters podcast. I'm Xandra, your host, and I'm also the creator of the Slow Style Approach to Designing Your Dream Home. On this show, you'll hear lots of interviews with really talented people working in interiors. Most of them are designers, some are makers and artists, and many of them are authors. Sometimes I also record a solo show where it's just me and I share pieces of my slow style design framework that puts you at the front and center of your home rather than products or trends and other people's idea of what beauty is supposed to look like. If that sounds good to you and you're itching to get started, you can download our free worksheet called The Dream Home Action Plan. You can find it at littleyellowcouch.com. Before we get started, I'm excited to announce that early bird access to my online course, Master the Mix, is now available. The purpose of the course is to transform a room in your home using primarily what you already have in about 4 weeks. It's an online course, but there's lots of live components where you and I will be able to see each other and talk in real time all about your project. Sign up ends June 6th and the course starts the next day on June 7th. There's a lot of information about the course and what to expect and what you'll learn and accomplish, all on the website littleyellowcouch.com/master the mix, or just go to littleyellowcouch.com and click on course right at the top. And one more thing, you may know this already, but I'm still offering a couple of free masterclasses this week. There's still time to sign up. It's live on Zoom. There are 4 different times to choose from. Coming to that is the best way to know if you like my teaching style, my design approach, etc. Plus it's live, so I'll stay on to answer any questions you have about your home. And it's free. So sign up for that too, also at littleyellowcouch.com. And it's packed with a lot of great info. It's called The Number One Reason Your Home Doesn't Look and Feel How You Want It to, and How to Fix It. And again, it's happening this week. Okay, that was a lot of information. Thanks for hanging in there with me. Let's get on with today's episode. It is truly my great privilege to introduce you to my guest today. Newell Turner is a bit of a legend when it comes to design and journalism. He's responsible for the formation of the entire Hearst magazine editorial division, heading up 3 big shelter magazines, Elle Decor, House Beautiful, and Veranda. I have been a fan of his for a very long time. I have kept many of the magazines in which he has served as editor-in-chief, and he has since moved on and just released a gorgeous new book called Mexican, A Journey Through Design, which showcases not only his own photography, but also his obvious love for his adopted country. The book is one that you want to sink into and absorb the colors and the textures and the exquisite details as he takes us through various design eras throughout Mexico's history. But if I do say so myself, this conversation with Newell is a pretty good companion piece to the book because of how warm and candid he is. So I encourage you to grab a copy, pour yourself a glass of wine, and start leisurely flipping through the pages as you listen to us chat. This has definitely been one of my favorite interviews I've ever done. Let's get to it. Newell Turner, what an honor it is to have you on the show. Welcome to Style Matters.
Listen, the honor is mutual. I'm thrilled to be here talking with you.
Thank you. Before we dive into this beautiful book, I want to get a little personal and ask you what was going on in your life when you moved to Mexico. I know you'd been there when you were much younger, 20 years maybe before you started this new journey. Your very first words in the book are, "My story is a classical expat story, the combination of an escape and the search for something missing in my life." So what was going on at that time when you were transitioning to homeownership in Mexico? And had you left Hearst? What was the missing thing you were hoping to find?
Well, to back up just a little bit, I spent 30 years of my career exploring American interior design and architecture across a number of magazines, but all of them were always searching for kind of the core of what is American style.
Yeah.
And in that process, clearly there's been an influence from south of the border, from Mexico in particular, on the border states and design as it evolved there. But I kept running across, references to Mexico and how Mexico had played a role in this or that designer's perceptions and work. Then in the early 90s, I was sent down to San Ignacio, Texas, to do a story on an artist named Michael Tracy, who's still living there.
Yeah.
And he's both a fine artist, but also, it's inevitable in Mexico. If you have any sort of design impulse, you can't help starting to tap into the reservoir of craftsmen that are here.
Oh, right.
And Michael had started making furniture, and he had done this performance piece on the Rio Grande where he launched this crucifix into the river, and it flowed down the river, touching each side of the border as it drifted down.
Oh, wow.
And he's sort of fanatical in a positive way about this lack of more design exchange on a north-south axis between states and Mexico.
Right.
There is a history of it on the border states, but in a whole, the United States is so oriented east and west, or west towards Europe, and even east towards Asia.
Right.
That was really kind of the point that I identify of really starting to pay attention to Mexican design. And through my work covering American designers, really looking into those areas where they were finding influences in Mexico. So California in particular, which is where I believe American design synthesized into something distinctly American.
Okay.
Designed to come across the country. I don't want to get too obscure with this, but
no, go. I love it.
Think of design influences coming from Europe, landing on the East Coast, still very, very European in orientation. Right. And you're starting to get a little bit of Eastern influence, but as design moved with the migration of Americans to the West Coast, it started taking on elements I feel are very American in the broad sense, meaning the Americas, not just the United States.
Right.
So like scale and materials. And then as it got to the East Coast, it got more influence from the Far East. And in California, among a group of decorators, a look started taking shape. I would call out John Dickinson and Michael Tracy as being huge influences on what today is American design that we see through all sorts of retail sources like Sonoma. And it really kind of took shape there in large part due to the craftsmanship that was coming up from Mexico.
Interesting, right.
Wonderful tradition of carving and stonework and weaving. So I feel like American or United States design has a lot of roots in Mexico. And I set out on this journey at this stage in my life of really indulging myself with that and the pursuit of that and the exploration of it. And, if anything, I want my book to continue opening that dialogue between Mexico and the United States in design, because both countries have so much to benefit from that sort of cultural exchange and design.
Right.
And you see it happening already in food. There's just huge, movement in food and even in the art world now with the big art fair in Mexico City. There's just an increasingly open, multidimensional look at Mexico and realization that there's so much more here than so many Americans or people in the United States quite know.
Right. I agree. Yes. Myself included. I've spent a lot of time in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I very much am aware of a melding of Mexican and indigenous art forms, and especially use of material and color that really come together in Santa Fe. And then on top of that, Santa Fe, I think it's the second largest art market in the country. And it is not, as I put in quotes, Southwestern art, right? It's global. They have artists from all over the world, and they've got a gazillion galleries and everything. And so there's this global kind of melding there. But there's this undercurrent, very prevalent undercurrent of Mexican and native movements that are going on design-wise.
Yeah, and there's an analogy I like to use, especially for New Yorkers. Years ago, would refer to Brooklyn as Brooklyn.
Oh,
as Brooklyn has blown up. You
Right.
don't just say Brooklyn anymore. It's either Park Slope or Brooklyn Heights or Gowanus
Right.
or any of those
Right.
neighborhoods. And Mexico is very much like that. It's Mexico, but there is such a diverse design sensibility here.
Mm,
And, it's a huge country
right.
and certain things have played out here historically in design in ways that are different from what we think of in the United States with such a heavy East Coast influence on design.
Right. That's a great point. I mean, there's all of the geographic differences in Mexico too. It's not just desert, which I think a lot of people assume.
It's certainly not that. And I do want to say, my book is a very personal journey. I hope it's maybe the first of others to come.
Yeah.
But my book really, although there are projects and references from all over Mexico, really,
Right.
the core of the content of my book comes from Mexico City, San Miguel de Allende, which has a long, long history of expats, and Merida, where I now call home too,
Right.
which is in the Yucatan. We're due south of New Orleans, which incidentally has always had a long history of design exchange with Mexico through these two cities.
Okay.
And then we're due east of Havana. We're probably closer to Havana than we are to New Orleans.
Wow.
So we're in this wonderful, rich area of design history in Mexico.
Yes.
So spending more and more time here over the years really opened my eyes and just became more and more compelling for me. The story of Mexican design became more and more compelling, and I had to do something. So
you had to do something. Yes.
Given
and
my
I'm
history,
so glad you did.
Thing.
One of my leading curiosities when it comes to design is the particular sense of place you get from a country or a culture, even a neighborhood. And I think this book really captures this idea. But what's interesting, you're saying too, is that there's so many places. It's not just one place. It's not just homogeneous Mexico, but every different chapter or home, you get this sense of place. And I know that your overarching question for the book was, what is Mexican style? Just as you said, you spent, the early part of your career, what is American style? You already know, you're going into it knowing that different cultural influences are going to be making up the style and design that we see. You call it in the book a mole as opposed to a gravy. And tell us what you meant about that. I thought that was so great.
Well, that's my other favorite analogy, and it's no disrespect to American design. It's maybe a bit of an oversimplification, but, gravy in the United States, even in different cultures within the United States, like Italian gravy,
right?
It's really a handful of influences that are happening at any given place, because I do also believe in design that's rooted in location.
Yeah.
But it's at any given time, it's only a handful. You could count the influences on one hand in most design work, but a mole is at a minimum 10. So at a gravy in the United States has a handful of references.
Ingredients,
whereas in
right?
Mexico, a mole is at least 10 ingredients, often up to 30 something ingredients.
Oh, wow.
So common and refined, exotic and indigenous. And what I'm continue to find, because it's kind of my life passion now, is that, in Mexico, and as you can see in the book, so many layers of things are often happening in one place. And I find that incredibly fascinating, especially when you back up and think about design was happening here in the 16th century.
Yeah. Right.
And the oldest public library in North America, which has two spreads in the book, was built in, I think, 1592.
Wow. That's amazing.
It's in Puebla, which is a city just south of Mexico City. And it's extraordinary. It's one of the most beautiful vaulted spaces with stacks on several levels and volumes and volumes of books.
Right.
So, there's been a design history that's much deeper than the United States for, centuries.
Right. And then you have the incredible cultures, the Mayan and the Aztec. and more cultures I mean, we're talking about very advanced civilizations here. They
Absolutely.
certainly were bringing design into their lives that still exists in Mexico today.
Well, I mean, honestly, that's really a big part of Mexican design because it's inescapable. I mean, the craftsmanship here goes back eons. And so anything that's come from the outside influencing design or design trends or design directions have always had some layer of the indigenous cultures, particularly through craft and color, even layered and combined with that, making that mole of design that is distinctly Mexican.
Yes.
Really distinctly Mexican.
Yes. You mentioned color. So I want to take just a quick detour before we get into how you've organized the book, which I love, by the way. But I just saw this great quote of yours somewhere. I don't know where I read it, but this is back. You're editor-in-chief of House Beautiful. And you said, what sex is to Cosmo, color is to House Beautiful. And I'm bringing that up now because color is this very striking element in your book. And I wonder if you see it as a major through line in the different eras that you've dissected.
Well, I do. I mean, it is because color, interestingly, is a lot easier to use here because of our light. Being further south, able to use stronger colors than you could in the further northern areas of the Americas. And color, goes back to all these indigenous cultures that were developing dyes, magenta dyes back during the Olmec period. Even painting, most people think of the ruins that you find here, the pyramids, the palaces from the Aztecs were covered in red often. They were often painted red. So you have to kind of remember that color is intrinsically involved with Mexican design. And I want to say this right here too with color is I think of neutrals as color. So when I say color, I'm not really just referencing strong, vibrant colors. I'm talking about the whole spectrum of color, even all these shades of white. You just get a lot of that used here in ways that you don't always see in the United States. And then color in Mexico has had a pretty important impact on movements of design like modernism. Modernism always struggled, coming out of Europe and the United States, always struggled with a sense of warmth and hand touch.
Absolutely.
Had a lot of the women in the modernism movement working in textiles. And they were using some textiles to bring warmth to the architecture. But here in Mexico, you had, of course, the iconic Luis Barragan and his whole long list of proteges, School of Architecture in Guadalajara that he helped co-found, introduced color to modernism in a way that really humanized it and warmed it up and made it something that I believe you can really live with. And even large, expanses of glass in the architecture, where in the United States, domestic architecture is often more outlooking. So out, and it's very American in the sense that it's what always blows Europeans away is this sense of expansiveness.
Right.
And our architecture, domestic in particular, is always looking out to the exterior. Here, you had them shaping the architecture with glass, in the case of modernism, to look inward and frame very particular views. And this comes out of the tradition of marrying with Spanish architecture, back to Islamic architecture, even this sort of inward looking architecture with courtyards, in particular, which is one of the reasons that drew me to Mexico. I've always had a passion for courtyards.
The interior courtyards where, you walk in and then it's this incredible enveloping of space and like you said, humanity. I mean, it's such and in the photos that you show of some of them are they're breathtaking.
Well, it's wonderful in the sense that you can really control what you see. You don't have to think about your neighbors.
That's true. Or the car that's parked outside that's in your view out your front window, right?
you're not necessarily looking at your neighbors. You're looking at your own world inside, and it gives you a lot of opportunity to create that view. So
Right.
I'm just really attracted to the architecture that came out of Spain and
Mm-hmm.
further east through Spain,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and how that's played out. So, I mean, I've just renovated a house here in Merida that's in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, I was just finishing the house, so I was just starting to furnish it. So it's more about the architecture of the house.
Yeah.
And it's been so much fun working with the architects and craftsmen to restore this old house.
Oh, I
It was built,
bet.
it's in the Spanish style, but it has a lot of neoclassical icing, as I would say it, in the architecture.
Okay.
And then the pasta tiles, that most of which were original to the house, have a very Far Eastern influence in the
Mm-hmm.
design. So
Mm-hmm.
you get this sort of North African, French neoclassical meets Spanish architecture. Mole.
Yes,
Mole.
exactly. I
So,
love it.
it's just, it's just a lovely way to live. And it's a lovely way to create a space for yourself. You have so much to draw from. And I think, creating a home environment through design is incredibly important with whatever you're working with,
Mm-hmm.
because if you don't appreciate beauty, it's going to be harder and harder to find it in your life. So
Mm.
a designer friend of mine, I want to attribute to Charlotte Moss,
Okay.
once said, if you raise your children with beauty, they will spend the rest of their life in pursuit of beauty.
Oh, isn't that beautiful?
That's such a nice thought,
Yeah.
And I was fortunate to have parents that appreciated beauty and had some interior designers that were friends that worked with them on their house and had an impact on me. I
Yeah,
mean,
clearly.
my whole
Wow.
life has been pursuing beauty and understanding design. So
Oh, wow. You just referenced a couple of different eras that are coming together in your own home. And I want to now mention that this is how the book is organized. It's organized, it kind of takes us through history. And I think this is such a great way of putting together a design book. And not many are put together this way, but it really helps us understand how different time periods, different influences were kind of starting to layer on top of each other. And what's very useful as a tool for people who want to learn about design. Like it's not necessarily for designers, this book. I mean, of course, designers, I'm sure, love it, but I mean, it is for any of us, all of us who just care about how design works, how it's come to be, what its influences are. And I want to talk about a few of these chapters, a few of these eras, and we're not going to get to them all, and that's okay because everybody needs to go buy the book. But let's start with the first of them because I love these in particular, the pre-Columbian era. So, before the conquest was happening. And that's one chapter. And then you go into a couple of other chapters on Baroque and colonial design. So we're listening now. We don't necessarily have the books in front of us. So can you give us some examples of design elements that were representing these eras and how they're layered on top of each other?
So the book has 9 chapters. So they're basically 9 decorative periods that I used as a structure to guide my narrative of Mexican design. And the first one, as you've just said, is pre-Columbian. And, the book is not all encompassing, but I wanted it to be enough to introduce people if they weren't familiar with these different decorative periods in the history of Mexican design.
Exactly.
And, there's some chapters that, are kind of expected, like pre-Columbian, because there was multiple great civilizations here that left enormous amounts of architecture and crafts that are still being uncovered everywhere. The Maya in particular had a great influence, but the book also is a little bit different from your traditional shelter or design magazine book or design book in that it's house and architecture forward. So there are rooms and architecture primarily, but layered within all of those spaces is other photography that references cultural aspects of Mexico, from archaeology to food to fashion, all these other different things that influence decorating, and a light term that influence decorating. And I felt like it was really important to give people some context that way. And I personally think it makes the book much more enjoyable.
Oh,
I mean, it's a lot of the way we would do magazine stories, which is to visually help people connect to a subject that they might not have ever thought they were interested in.
Right, right.
Another chapter, and I don't want to skip too far ahead, but is surrealism.
Okay,
And
yeah, let's talk about that.
surrealism was really an art movement that started in France and came to the United States and came to Mexico. But in Mexico, it's sort of found a fertile home. There's always been this sort of magical surrealism in Mexican design and going back to pre-Columbian design, that it just took root here in a way that I was surprised by how much it manifested in design and architecture. You know, it's so many places and historically you only think of it as art, but here it's a period of design that is still really alive and growing in this, and blooming in this amazing way. There's so much of that surrealism in Mexican design, even from simple things like the use of color, but also through the structure and architecture of whole buildings.
Right.
I guess I'm running away a little bit, but
no, that's okay.
You know, I just found looking at Mexican design through historic design periods gave it a structure that helped introduce people in a lovely way to Mexico.
I completely agree. I just thought that I can't really say enough about the impact that how you organized the book had on me to absorb the concepts that you were talking about. And, you know, like there's this one, I think this is in the pre-Columbian chapter, but there's just this beautiful picture of the feathers of a spoonbill.
Yeah.
And then, you know, right next to it is a picture of I don't remember now if it's an interior or an exterior, but I mean, it was like, oh, and the color of the multiple colors that are in those pink feathers, it's not just one pink, you know, showing up in buildings. And then, you know, for the surrealist section, we do think of surrealism as an art movement that happened in Europe. You know, we don't, and I guess coming over to the United States, but I mean, it's so wonderful to see how a completely different culture interpreted that and ran away with it. It's a great chapter. And you've got a chapter called Art Deco. None of us in the United States would ever associate Art Deco with Mexico. And yet there it is.
It is.
Yeah.
You know, it was a real eye opener for me because, you know, traditionally in the United States, you think of Art Deco more in the context of public buildings.
Right.
There is domestic architecture in the Art Deco style in the United States. But here, I think it was because of the cultural use of concrete and history of using concrete to embellish. I mean, the indigenous cultures in Mexico were working with concrete eons ago.
Wow.
Version. I mean, it's attributed, and you think of it in a lot of cases as coming from the Romans, but the Maya were also working in concrete.
Wow.
And where I'm going is that it's amazing to me how much domestic architecture, and I'm not even talking about grand domestic architecture, even small, humble domestic architecture in neighborhoods throughout Mexico in the Art Deco style.
Yeah. Wow.
And it's quite wonderful. And there's a branch of Art Deco that developed here called Maya Deco. And that particularly interested me because of the influence on Deco that you just don't see anywhere else happen.
Right. I haven't seen it anywhere else. It was really eye-opening.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the fact that clearly the decoration of space or the search for beauty, as you've said, is so infused with this within this culture. It matters everywhere. It matters in the colors that are composed in the food on a plate. It matters in, like you said, in humble areas. It matters in alleyways and the tile, you know, on a sign, a restaurant. I mean, it's very absorbing and that's very exciting.
Yeah. I mean, I've been coming to Merida in particular for at least 8 years on a very regular basis. And then I just spent the last year and a half here full time, a couple of trips back to the States. And that was really due to the renovation of the house. But
yeah,
I am still walking the streets of Merida and seeing things that, you know, I never saw before. And then realizing, you know, it's of this period or that period. And then connecting the dots and realizing how much it's influenced the whole experience of the city.
Yeah. Okay.
People's lives. I mean, just the fact that very humble, people live in Art Deco houses is astonishing to me,
Right.
wonderful, inspiring. And I love seeing it and finding it. And it's kind of, style is, it's a part of everybody's life. So I'm speaking very broadly and making some general statements here that a lot of people could debate with me, but I feel like there's a sense of design and style here in Mexico that runs up and down the economic ladder.
Yeah,
And there's an
right.
appreciation for design, even when, as we always preached at House Beautiful, color can make a difference in your life. The
Yeah.
colors you choose to surround yourself with, and paint's the least expensive thing you can do in decorating.
It sure is. Yep. It's transformative. So I'm going to ask you a question that is just coming to me now. So I didn't prep you with this. I'm sensing a difference that we could point to between the American idea of style, which has become, if you're not like really in the design world and, living there every day, but just generally speaking about America, style has become this sort of add-on and sometimes very, not just superfluous, but kind of, what's the word, frivolous. It's not always connected with who people are in their daily lives. And it sounds to me like, we can debate that, but it sounds to me like in Mexico, it's coming from within more. It's not this outside influence like, oh, I'm going to buy the latest trend and stick it on my living room coffee table. Is that a fair assessment?
That's a really interesting and very fair assessment, I would say. And again, I think it may come back to the simple fact that there's so much opportunity to pull from decorative traditions here. You're really not furnishing a white box in the sky. Typically,
Yeah,
you
right.
are creating something that's very connected to the place.
Yeah.
It's not disassociated usually with, what's happening around it or where it is geographically, climatically, whatever. It's just much more draw from, frankly. And it's drawing from something that has a much richer and longer history. I feel like, wonderful things have happened in American design in the United States through commerce, through companies that have really made design accessible, more accessible
Right.
than ever. Then when I started my career in publishing, you had to look hard to find a beautiful white plate.
Right. Something as simple as that. Right.
Something as simple as a beautiful white plate. Now in the United States, it's just so much more accessible. And I think that tradition has been much accessibility and, resources have just have a much longer history here in Mexico.
Okay.
And those resources have shaped America in a lot of ways that people find surprising if they go to it and started really exploring back.
Like where it came from. Yeah. So you mentioned something about your own house, tying to what you just said about it. I don't remember exactly what you said, but it was something about it wasn't a blank slate and you were excited about that. And I think that's what we're just talking about. And I think that your own home, I believe, was during the time, the kind of neoclassical era in Mexico. It was only about 30 years long, around the turn of the 19th century, but it was this very influential time. And it was, I think, influenced by the French Revolution, French design associated with these progressive ideals of freedom, liberté. So can you give us a couple of examples, and maybe you want to reference your own home for this? How does that idea of liberty show up in the design of that era?
Yeah, I'll give you a real quick synopsis of that period.
Okay.
So, indigenous, colonial, Baroque architecture and design lived for a long time or developed for a long time in Mexico. And then Mexico elected a president in the late 1800s named Porfirio Diaz. And Porfirio Diaz stayed in power as a president, sometimes more dictator personality. But for a long time, he was president of the country. About that 30-year period, it's called the Porfiriato era.
Yeah.
And he was a man who was a politician, the president of the country, who was also very interested in design. And like America, so many cultures turned to France because of the great traditions of design and refinement and elegance. And he was really obsessed with it. And his obsession led to a lot of things being done on the citywide scale in Mexico, even here in Merida before he made a visit here around the turn of the century. They did what they did in Paris. They created a boulevard. It's our version of the Champs-Élysées. It's Paseo de Montejo. And it was built in preparation for his coming to visit Merida. and all of the families that made huge fortunes off of the Henneken plantations. These incredible mansions along in that French neoclassical style, typically, although there are some great examples of Art Deco and colonial. But I think Porfiriato had such a huge influence on the country, really looking to France, as the United States did, and, welcoming those ideas of liberty and independence.
Despite the fact that he was a kind of dictatorial, but
and despite the fact that France wasn't really the most perfect example of liberty and freedom, but it's it just had a really, I would say it might have been like the first real decorative push outside of the traditional Spanish influence.
Okay, right.
Spanish brought.
Yeah, interesting. Right.
As brought for hundreds of years a lot of architectural and design influences that were Spanish in origin, but then going back further to the Middle East.
Right.
That you really have in the United States. At all.
Because of Spain's connection to the Middle East and that blending there of that particular part of Spain with Moorish architecture and that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
The Moorish architecture that came out of Persia originally. So I don't know, Mexico has had its, very interesting political history, and it's played a role in an interesting way in the design history of this country.
Yeah.
Because neoclassicism, or French style, let's call it, became associated with progress and moving forward.
Okay.
And the decorative nature of it was simply an easy way to update a lot of colonial architecture.
Okay.
And, and it was both political and design at the same time.
Yeah. How does it show up in your home?
It's interesting. It shows up, the floor plan of my house and the scale of the rooms is very Spanish. The architecture structurally is. But then in my center courtyard, one of the things that really attracted us to the house was the center courtyard. I'm looking out the window now at our courtyard, which, was a real important feature to us in this house. And it's a bit unusual in that it has a very decorative frieze work around the top.
Okay.
And working within that frieze are acanthus leaves, shells, feathers, and 6 liberties. So that gave us the name for our house, the House of 6 Faces.
I love it. Oh.
And it's, it's unusual to have that kind of decorative frieze work internally.
Okay.
Did a lot outside, but the people that built this house, the family, I don't know, I guess really cherished this sort of courtyard view they have.
Yeah. Yeah.
And dedicated a lot of the design to it, the decorative design to this sort of classical element.
So that's a great example of educating us about when I'm looking at that, what am I looking at in terms of the politics, the culture that was coming out during that time? Are there, like I said, every chapter in this book, every era in this book is so rich. And so obviously we don't have time to get to all of them. So I'm wondering if you have one more that I haven't mentioned or we haven't mentioned yet that you want to just highlight.
Well, we've touched on some of my particular favorites, but I will say I'll come back to surrealism.
Okay, yeah.
It's such a magical element of design that has not really been explored elsewhere so literally. And I think that it's touched on things that I think are relevant for, design today through biomorphic shapes. And it really opens the door, or it opened the door for Mexican design to evolve into a very interesting world of contemporary design, which is where the book into. Right. And it's an element that you see after that period of surrealism when it started, you see it continuing throughout the rest of the design history here. And that's another thing I would point out. I hope people will buy the book because it's interesting to see things in the context of decorative periods, but it also challenges the reader or the viewer, because it's really a book of photography, to consider things. There's no pure style here.
Right.
In other words, all decorative periods, have had some influence that has continued as they've been layered into Mexican design. So you'll get contemporary and suddenly you'll see something that's Baroque. And that was very intentional on my part to make you think about the contemporary in terms of what came before in the Baroque. So houses and interiors that could go in a couple of different chapters. Because of combined influence of design. But to simplify it, to kind of help people understand it, I did force myself to break things down by decorative period. And again, like I just said, that I think opens people's eyes to look at things in new ways, especially when you see the visual narrative of the book contrast and compare other periods in each chapter.
Exactly.
So, it's a book about interiors and architecture, but it's just layered with things that I think, and I would say you seem to agree too, are so important in the context of design, and that's context and relevant, the roots of where something comes from.
Right.
And it's what everything feels here in Mexico feels like it comes out of the place. Contemporary design.
Yeah.
And I love that. And it's just so rich. I'm just scratching the surface here.
I love that too. Give us more. Yes.
Scratching the
another
surface. Book. I encourage people to travel in Mexico. I mean,
I challenge anyone to look at this book and then not want to get on a plane immediately. I mean, it's just fantastic.
And Mexico is a lovely place. It's just a great place to come for inspiration. And both the United States and Mexico have so much to offer each other. I want this dialogue of design, to borrow an expression from someone else, to continue and grow rich. Design is a language in and of itself. It doesn't require you to speak English or Spanish.
Right.
You can express yourself and communicate and have a dialogue through design that doesn't require you to speak one language or another. It's a common language that we all can enjoy and communicate and learn from each other through.
I love that. And that could probably be the beginning of your answer to my question, why does style matter? You were touching on it, I think, a little earlier. How do you answer that question?
Style matters. Style/design matters because, we've talked about a couple of reasons, but it just has the ability to uplift your life, but more importantly, bring a certain sense of order and enjoyment to everyday life. I mean, the plate you choose to put on your table is as important as the sofa you choose to sit on or the color you choose to paint your wall.
Yeah.
Design has the ability to improve our lives. I mean, all the magazines that I've worked for in the United States have always had that as sort of their core value, that design is important and design has the ability to transform our lives. And today, more than ever in history, we have access to it. That is just, astonishing. I mean,
it is.
Sounds silly to talk about it, but just the accessibility of design today can be a challenge for people. To express themselves.
It's a little overwhelming.
So much to choose from.
Right.
But why would you live with something ugly when you could have something that makes you feel good and you find beautiful? I mean, we all find beauty in different ways and in different places. And beauty is just something that shouldn't be short-shifted in our lives. I've always said the choice you make for your bathroom sink faucet and handle is important because it's one of the first things you touch in the morning.
Absolutely.
And that should make you feel good in whatever way that is.
Yeah.
Oh, and it sounds a bit silly, but it's really not. And I think people today are becoming more and more aware of it as we become more and more detached from reality through the digital world.
Right.
This sense of tangible environments is going to becoming more and more important. And
That's
that's the person to say that. But
no,
it's
but
really,
that's prescient. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then and the one thing I want to say, repeat about beauty is that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Another silly quote, but it's true. It's in the eye of the beholder. And that's where style comes from. I've always enjoyed that part of my job, looking at how other people see beauty and how it manifests in their style.
Yeah.
We're all making choices every day that are style oriented or based, from the clothes we put on to how we present ourselves. And the opportunity to create your style through a space has an effect. If you haven't discovered it, you should discover it. Can just transforms how you see the world.
Right.
And your personal space is very important.
Yeah. Oh, beautifully said. And I think that, it's kind of, I equate developing one's personal style with self-reflection, personal development. It's like journaling, only you're creating a vignette, or, you're choosing a pattern, or it can be, if you tap into it, it can be very rewarding. And it really, I think, helps you grow as a person, and especially if you're following your curiosity, which you are, your whole life, I believe, has been about following your curiosity.
I've been very blessed to be able to indulge my curiosity that way.
Yeah.
I was a very curious child, and I'm interested in a lot of things to a fault. But now those many things are now increasingly focused on Mexico, because it's a world that I didn't quite understand before. And I may not ever understand it, because I'll always be an expat. But it is a place that has welcomed me already, that I feel completely at home and comfortable here. And it's a new chapter for me to discover.
So exciting. Well, thank you for letting us live vicariously through you, through this. As I said earlier, when we were talking, it's like reading a romance novel, only it's photos, right? It's, oh my gosh. I mean, you make us fall in love with it. So thank you so much for this gorgeous book. And thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much. It was really lovely speaking with you. Thank you again.
Thank you as well. Thanks so much for listening. I hope that was interesting and inspiring for you. Don't forget that my signature online course is starting soon. Sign up ends June 6th. The course starts June 7th. Sign up now. I would love to have you. And there's all kinds of information that you can find on our website, littleyellowcouch.com. Take care. Have a great